I want to take just 2 seconds to share with you some of his thoughts on the subject from an interview with me last January, and hear for yourselves the infectious and invigorating energy, excitement, and possibility in his voice as he inspires us to engage with a new wired world. And as he puts it, quote, how the resources of the web are capable of being promoted in particular directions. And in this case, in the directions of people creating a mutually made university function, a higher learning function, where expertise is being engaged to teach courses, but learning is as much from peers, from each other, as it is from the expert. The expert is now not somebody who talks down at once with an expert body of knowledge that one is supposed to soak up. The expert is an orchestrator, a facilitator, conductor. It is a very different conception of knowledge formation and of learning, and how learning is done together. The authority of knowledge is differently placed. These resources are making possible a rethinking, a resourcing, a redirecting of possibility of how people learn, how they learn in relation to each other and what they learn. And I think that's quite radical, end quote. David Theo Goldberg is the director of a system-wide University of California Humanities Research Institute and an executive director of the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub. He also holds faculty appointments as professor of comparative literature and criminology, law, and society at UC Irvine. He is also a fellow of the UCI Critical Theory Institute, a prolific writer. Some of his recent books include The Threat of Race, Reflections on Racial Neoliberalism, The Racial State, and with the aforementioned Cathy Davidson, The Future of Thinking, Learning Institutions in a Digital Age. Please join me in giving David Theo Goldberg the gracious welcome he deserves.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. As Susan said, on a warm morning, which I guess is unseasonable for here. Right? It's beginning to feel more like California than California, which is probably the way of the world at the moment. So I'm just going to talk through a bunch of slides, and Danielle has kindly agreed to Google jockeys, so we'll get what we get sort of as we move along here, just as a way of proceeding. So what I thought I'd do is to just frame the sort of transformation of knowledge conception and the pressures on knowledge conception as a result of the development and impacts of digital media over time, and then to sort of pose a few challenges towards the end. And also to, I don't know how much most of you know about the sort of history of the emergence of digital humanities, but I'll talk a bit about that along the way. So the first thing to point out is that there are multiple literacies at work that sort of impact how now we think. It's almost a cliche to say that the humanities, whenever the humanities are defended, by humanities administrators and so on, the recourse to literacies, civic literacies, citizen sorts of literacies for democracy, are the kind of fallback position, right? That's what we do, even when we don't, right? In a certain manner of speaking. And so this is a nice visual about the sorts of literacies that come to be, we're increasingly engaged and sort of come into a kind of intersection of networking, as I'll sort of stress in just a second, in relation to information and what we ought to be doing really within the humanities. We do it in a checkered way, but what we ought to have a more systematic focus around. And so there's a sort of, what comes out of this is a notion of networking, and I want to stress the kind of working in networking, right? The way and the transformation in working as a result of networking. Again, some of which is cliched, some of which is, Henry at dinner last night sort of raised a concern about the sort of silo effect even of networking, and that's true, it can place one in silos, but so the networking is both within a kind of group formation and then across group formations, right? And it transforms perhaps how we think of working, not least in the humanities, where the presumption has usually been, if not always been, that of the hermetic individual auteur, the brilliant scholar kind of sitting in the carrel. The concern is, of course, that humanistic scholars are as brilliant or not as brilliant as anybody else, right? I mean, just ordinary people who happen to have a passion about something or other, and to work away at it, and sometimes hermetically and sometimes, in collaboration with each other, even as they deny the collaboration, which I'll come back to in due course. So I want to suggest, I mean, anybody know what this image is from?
Hobbes.
Yeah, Hobbes' Leviathan, right? The original frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan. So what I want to point to here is there's a kind of, in the social contract that Hobbes is sort of inscribing, right, in terms of the sovereign, there's a kind of networking of citizen subjects in relation to each other, but it's a very hierarchical conception. They're part of the body politic, literally, of the corporate body of the sovereign. The networking is between them individually, I mean that's the contract you might say, and then collectively as a group between the body politic and the sovereign who stands above them. But they make up, in a sense, the body politic of the sovereign subject, right? And that's one way of sort of thinking about it, a kind of network, but it's very hierarchicalized. It's not flattened in the way. And I want to contrast that with the kind of, what is the sort of presumption now around peer-to-peer participatory engagement, right? Much more horizontal, much more engaged with each other in more or less equal status. I mean, that's why I picked a picture of women sitting on the floor, right? Kind of, even as it's sort of culturally inscribed. But there's a kind of peer-to-peer engagement which begins to transform how we think about that notion of networking to some degree. So Manuel Castells has famously written about networking society and has laid out sort of three conceptions, three elements of what it is to establish or engage in a network or networking economy. The first, of course, is networking technologies, the kinds of technologies that have now become our everyday, right? The sorts of technologies we use, social media, in various sorts of ways, hardware, software, and so on and so forth, without which, this notion of the emergent network economy would not exist. The second is a workforce trained and organized to work in these ways, using these technologies, interactive with each other, right? One in which the training, again, is more horizontal than hierarchical, right? And the third is what he regards as a new mode of organizing, which includes knowledge organization around networking, right? And obviously we've seen, 15 or more years of that sort of taking place in, fairly intensive kinds of ways. Now, what that does is it places pressure on our thinking about a conception of knowledge, right? It's kind of what we take knowledge to be and how knowledge is organized in these sorts of ways. So the first thing I want to contrast networking knowledge with is knowledge networks, right? And I want to suggest that knowledge networks, right, are predicated on existing and established epistemological models. They leave, in a sense, knowledge unchanged. It's the kind of accumulative effect of existing forms of knowledge anyway, right? So we're adding volume. We're not changing the way in which knowledge is produced, right? And B, the very nature of knowledge itself, right? So that's the first thing to point out. The second is that it's pluralistic, right? That it creates many different I don't want to say kinds of knowledge, because maybe it's kinds of knowledge, but in increasing the volume of knowledge, it just sort of adds from different sources and so on and so forth. Right? And then the third is that it relies pretty much on kind of comparativism, right? That is, this notion of knowledge network says, well, there's a bunch of knowledge here and there's a bunch of knowledge there, and we'll compare this knowledge here to knowledge there. And obviously what I have in mind is a kind of comparativism that you find, say, in social science, for example, of comparing, the forms of organization or the kinds of politics that take place in one society, say the United States or Canada, with another society, say, I don't know, Brazil, South Africa, or Tanzania, or whatever, right? So largely leaving those knowledge comparisons discrete, unconnected to each other in some way. So I want to contrast that with what I'm calling, by contrast, network or networking knowledge. This is us. I don't think this is sort of societies that are, these kind of places out there that, I mean, in a sense, right, the sort of more or less standardized sort of conception of knowledge is fairly traditional. It's hierarchical, right? It's developed by authorities or expert authorities, right? It's centralized. There's a kind of monopoly over certain formations. Of course, that's begun to be challenged, you must say, at the edges, and transforming to, right, something like this model where it's decentralized sharing, participatory, much more horizontal than hierarchical, and inclusive. And I'll come to say more about that in due course. Okay, and the question then it raises is, does it change the way we think about the conception of knowledge itself, right, and how knowledge is produced? So the standard, this is a kind of meme map developed by Tim O'Reilly. I mean, you probably all know who Tim O'Reilly is, right? Which maps out, I mean, this is at least 5 or 6 years old, maybe, yeah, at least 5 or 6 years old now, which maps out Web 2.0, and I'll contrast Web 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 in a minute. But it sort of lays out the kind of characterizations, right, around what we are regarding as Web 2.0. So, it calls it an attitude, not a technology, right? So it's how we think about the development of knowledge formation, information, how information is relational, that there's, hackability is an attitude, an engagement. So if you go on the Mozilla Foundation, Mozilla, I mean, I've mentioned this before. Mozilla, of course, is the holding organization, the non-profit for Firefox, the browser that you probably all use, right, along with 500 million other people every day. And if you go on their website, you'll notice a project called Hackosaurus, right, which is the using of sort of hacking capacities and capabilities in order to mash up and remix and remake and make, whether you're talking about knowledge, whether you're talking about things or products or engagements and so on and so forth. So here you have, I mean, a link to the Hackosaurus site, and it's worth just playing around with that and thinking about how that impacts the way you do things. The notion of a perpetual beta, right? Everything is constantly in creation, right? I mean, even when you think you're done, I mean, there's another version of it, right? So, as soon as a version is settled and you think, oh, now I have, version 9.135, right? Version 9.7 kind of comes out, or something like that, right? So it's constantly in development. Play is a major factor in here. So I mean, if you look at people like John C.D. Brown, the sort of director emeritus of Xerox PARC, for instance, he's constantly, stressing the notion of playing, learning, and engagement with each other. Looking at the lessons one might draw from playing World of Warcraft, both of the social lessons about war and so on, but actually the lessons one might get from how people learn, right? About ethical judgment, for example, in those massive multiplayer online games, right? And so on. And so forth. I mean, the kinds of virtues, trust and so on that develops out of these sorts of engagements. And this is just another sort of less dense version. What are the kinds of information structures, the kinds of tools that we use pretty much on a daily basis in terms of Web 2.0 activity, where Wikipedia, of course, I mean, Wikipedia is an very interesting example, right? So there's been a lot of critical engagement around the kind of knowledge that Wikipedia produces. So Wikipedia, you all know, I'm sure you all use it, if not on a daily basis, or fairly regularly. It's a easy information online source. I mean, the complaint is that our students, both in college and at schools, right, too readily kind of, take Wikipedia at face value and sort of just, you give them a subject to go and research, they go to Wikipedia and then they dump everything from Wikipedia down into their paper, pretty much without quoting it. And, I mean, that's the kind of cliche, right? It's kind of, and actually Wikipedia is a lot more interesting than that. There have been a number of studies that have been done comparing Wikipedia to Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, or Collier's. I noticed this week that Encyclopedia Britannica just ended its paper version, right? It's published, standard published version. I mean, they've been sort of moving in this direction. There was a version that was $3,000 or something like that, and they've gone now completely online, right? It's kind of. Now, the interesting thing is that when you compare Wikipedia on, any subject, I mean, there have been some studies on, say, American studies, right? The contributions to Wikipedia on American studies and the contributions to the Encyclopedia Britannica on American studies. So Roy Rosenzweig, before he died, a well-known American historian of US history, did a fairly extensive study. And he was fairly skeptical going in, and coming out, he showed, I mean, that Wikipedia fared better than Encyclopedia Britannica, surprise, surprise, right? Right, in relation to a whole range of topics within American studies. And it was more or less equal to Collier's, I think it was the sort of other comparison point. And if you take a whole range of comparisons, I mean, Wikipedia is fairly uneven, right? But I mean, the interesting thing is that it's constantly being revised, right? And anybody, I mean, somebody put up a Wikipedia page for me, and I've made critical contributions about Israel-Palestine, and I gave a talk at UC Santa Cruz, and there was some rabid Zionist Israeli woman in the audience, I mean, literally. And, she made my life hell for about 6 months afterwards. And, I went on my Wikipedia page, I don't know, about a year later, and she clearly, it was her, had dumped in a really pernicious sentence into my Wikipedia page about how derogatory I was about, Israel and the Holocaust, and charging Israel with being Nazis and so on and so forth, which I'd never done. So she had gotten editor capability and managed to get this included in my page. I tried to go in, and of course I couldn't change my own page, right? I mean, you're not allowed to do that. So I spoke to a colleague who's quite deeply connected with Wikipedia, and she just went in and changed it. Right? So, I mean, just an example, an illustration of how things get revised and re-revised and so on and so forth. I haven't looked to see if she's, if the crazy Israeli Zionist has gone back in and put the sentence in again, but I mean, who knows. Just you know, so Wikipedia is, you know, I've worked a bit with some of the people on the board at Wikipedia about that. You know, they're doing something quite interesting. I mean, they're really a fairly limited number of actual editors. I mean, anybody can contribute, but the editing pool is you know, fairly limited in scope. Actually, I mean, it's not very large. Interestingly enough, they really do want more educated editors to contribute, and have started a university program, you know, where across different universities they're interested in getting college instructors to teach their courses and to include a kind of Wikipedia editing sort of formation within the you know, writing up and editing articles. So there's a kind of training taking place on how to edit Wikipedia, and I think that's a kind of a fairly interesting way to go. I mean, anybody could do it. I mean, you could actually just contact them and say, I'm interested in joining this this project. I mean, they're a non-profit, so you know, you're not creating profit for them in some sense. They operate not on advertising, but on you know, contributions from people like you and me. Interesting, you know, and so. Here's you know, just a contrast of Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, just to give you a sort of sense of where things have come from, where things are going. You know, you remember that 1.0 was static web pages. I mean, the early development of the World Wide Web, right? Static pages, you know, in 10, 15 years ago, limited amount of users. Right, really, you know, at best a bit of hyperlinking. You can see Britannica sort of emerges fairly early online and so on. You know, the kinds of browsing that take place with Netscape was a principal browser at the time. I mean, you remember, you probably all old enough to remember using Netscape at some point, and you were viewing pages, almost, you know, static discrete pages for the most part. And it's, you know, advertising was a way in here. Web 2.0, which is, you know, largely the phase we've been in over the last decade or something like that, is, you know, as it says, a wildly read-write web, you know, where there's multiple participatory contribution. Blogging emerges with a vengeance, right, in all of this. Radical extension of sharing content. Wikipedia comes out, I mean, in contrast, say, to Britannica Online, which is, you know, Britannica Online was just Britannica offline put online, basically, right? Whereas Wikipedia has a different mode, as I've said, of its production. I mean, Britannica Online, the production of knowledge is very, very closely held, right? Whereas Wikipedia is much more distributed and expansive in the way I've been suggesting. You know, tagging becomes critical, right? How you mark metadata, right, in the tags and so on. And then, you know, its monetizing model is cost per click. Google sort of emerges out of this, right? So that you can, I mean, there's advertising that takes place, or you can, you know, you can put up. I mean, we've used Google in order to say promote a competition, right? In digital media and learning, for example, and you know, there's a limited cost for this first however many clicks, and then after that it expands exponentially. And you know, you can limit the number of clicks you want to pay for as well. And then Web 3.0 is, you know, has been emerging for a couple of years now, at least. You'll know it as a kind of personalization of information to which we're all being subjected. It's a bit more pernicious, right, in some sense. It's you know, the way in which corporations are personalizing, I mean, are doing massive data mining of consumer habits, right, and then personalizing both the information you get and the offerings you get. You know, so if you bought, or if you even web surfed for you know, I don't know, a particular brand of shoes or a motor car, this or that, then you start getting, you know, loads of offers, you know, that expand. And so for those of us who have radically heterogeneous tastes, who just, you know, go window shopping, you know, virtually for all sorts of things, or who browse for this, that, or whatever, I mean, it sort of upsets the kind of, you know, they don't quite know what to do with you, right? So I want to expand that kind of anarchic attitude, right? Because it kind of undermines, in a sense, the capacity. But there was a finish. I sort of excuse those who were at dinner last night, but the, you know, version which brings very clearly, brings out very clearly sort of how this works. Is Target, the company, right, the sort of department, the low-end department store, you know, not unlike Walmart and others, has been doing massive amounts of data mining of consumer habits at Target, right? So just, I mean, they have huge numbers of teams and servers dedicated to this phenomenon. And you know, they've been able to identify increasingly not only you know, by looking at the change in consumption habits of pregnant women, right? So when women get pregnant, right, habits of, I mean, taste change, right? Eating taste change. You start thinking about, you know, your future with, you know, your baby, is it a boy, is it a girl? You start sort of, you know, at least looking at certain products. And so on and so forth. And increasingly over time, over about a year, increasingly Walmart was able to identify the due date, right? And then the conception date, right? And then, you know, even when women were starting to think about getting pregnant. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. So a father went in and complained to a Target manager, right, in the Target store. I mean, you can see where this is going. You've been sending my 16-year-old daughter stuff on pregnancy. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, right? To go, what on earth are you doing? And they apologized profusely and said, oh, you know, mistakes happen, we're very sorry, we didn't mean to do this, and so on and so forth. And you know, he was a long-time customer at Target, and he went home, and the manager called him about 5 days later, and you know, to apologize and, you know, offer him another special offer from Target or something like that. Maybe now for, you know, aging fathers or whatever. And the father said, look, I'm really, really sorry. I owe you an apology. I came home and something was going on at home. And my daughter, in fact, is pregnant and you knew it before me. Right? So you can see the intrusiveness of kind of corporate invasion, right, in this. I mean, it's fairly stunning, actually. You know, so you want to be really careful of you know, what you admit are your actual investments in these sorts of things. The Web 3.0, you know, so radical focus on individualized sort of information streams, you know, through you know, streaming through loads and loads and loads of data. The semantic web, I think, is an interesting development. The semantic web shifts to, I mean, semantics, you know, is all about meaning and about the relations of meaning to each other through the stream of information. So the semantic web is being able to actually look through and develop programs and projects on the basis of meanings rather than the basis of flat information, right? So it's a much more interpretively driven set of capabilities and possibilities, which promises really to transform the way things are going. I mean, this notion of user behavior meonomy, right, is again a stress on that personalization of user engagement and so on. So that's where things are going. So in terms of knowledge conception, right, I mean, we've been sort of talking a bit about traditional knowledge formation in contrast to 2.0 knowledge formation. So traditional knowledge formation, I want to suggest, is authoritative, expert-driven, you know, teacher standing up in front of the classroom. I have the expertise, and this is how it works. and you'll be good, you know, it'll be good for you to listen to me. Whereas 2.0, 3.0 sort of pushes the notion of collaborative knowledge formation, creating knowledge together, and peer-to-peer engagement with each other. So I mentioned last night, Peertopeer University, which has been very interactive with, to some degree, funded by Mozilla, is a free university, right? It's run by a group of people, but the sort of leader is a guy by the name of Philip Schmidt. Very interesting guy, young German computer scientist. And they've created a platform. They're in the process of morphing into something else now, but they created a platform where anybody who had something interesting to offer as a course could actually offer it as a course, and then you know, for free, not be paid for it, teach it, right, or designate somebody to teach it, and it gets authorized by the peer learning community, sort of in that area, and then the development of badges as a certification for assessing, you know, people who've been through the course. I'll come back to badging towards the end. So Peer-to-Peer University, right, is you know, a kind of an institutionalizing form. There are other versions of it, but this one's really interesting, and it's thoroughly global. I mean, this is, you know, I mean, if we in the academy, in the university, face a challenge, it's from the likes of Peer-to-Peer University. They don't see themselves as, you know, posing a challenge to higher education. But the implication is that, you know, we're going to have to think about and respond to the kinds of activities they're involved in. They're completely global. So Philip lives in Cape Town. He's a German computer scientist who lives in Cape Town, who spends half his life in Silicon Valley, sometimes in Toronto, constantly moving around. The people he works with are in Toronto and on the West Coast, California, in London, in Sydney, and so on and so forth, right? So they're distributed sort of globally and are pretty mobile in that sense. And their students are worldwide. I mentioned last night as well, for some of you who were there, Stanford earlier this year, I think it was in the fall, offered a online course. I mean, so online learning is something else again, much more constrained, but offered a conventional course in artificial intelligence, an online course, right, by a really well-known Stanford computer scientist. So introduction to artificial intelligence. So how many people registered for the course, right? 160,000 people registered for it. I mean, you kind of, you know, that's what, 4 or 5 times the size of this whole university, right? Registering for a single course taught online by 2 Stanford professors. You know, about 40,000 finished the course, and I think 9,000 actually, you know, went through the exam at the end and got certified, sort of coming out of the course. And the guy, his name's Sebastian Theo, who started this at Stanford, has now spun off, right? He's left Stanford. I mean, he was going to leave Stanford anyway. He left Stanford, and he's created a company called Udacity, right? And Udacity is a company that will continue to offer these online courses in Sebastian Thrun, who are offering another version of this course. I mean, it's still in conjunction with Stanford. I mean, the Stanford brand, of course, is what attracts many people worldwide, right, to the course. MIT, you know, MIT has long been associated with open educational resources. They were the ones who started, or actually really institutionalized open educational resources, and they likewise, MITx are offering a kind of set of online courses. Stanford is interested in monetizing. MIT, at least in its own self-representation, is interested only in extending its brand, not in actually monetizing this for using this course. But you see the way, I mean, you know, online learning is still fairly conventional. I mean, right in terms of the kind of knowledge formation that it offers, you've still got expert standing in front of the room and so on and so forth. So it's, knowledge conception on the one hand is single and limited. Objects of knowledge on 2.0, 3.0, multiple objects of knowledge. There's a kind of, massive recourse to originality, right? So that authorship sort of theory of knowledge formation. Whereas 2.0 and 3.0 are stressing, remixing, mashups, remakings, and so on. I've mentioned the comparativity of the knowledge conception on the one hand, whereas I want to stress relationality, right? So a different way of thinking about the connections between things, right? So, instead of comparing, say, I don't know, South Africa and Brazil, historically around, say, racial formation, what are the relations that produced a common sort of set of conceptions for race making, say, in the middle of the 20th century, right? What relations were going on? Who was talking to whom? So, I mean, if you look at the history of race making from the 19th century onwards, I mean, it turns out that, the founders of eugenics all started out in South Africa. I mean, Galton kind of, was in South Africa, right, in the 19th century, dealing, sort of with skeleton collection. Robert Knox, the famous Scottish physician, right, he started out in what today is Namibia, Southwest Africa, right, so looking at Herrera, and so on. So what are the relations, right, in the development of knowledge formation that come out, that then produce, right, these transformative conceptions in whatever subject matter you're looking at? The first is monomedial, the latter is multimedia. And so I want to just run through this and say, so obviously mobile networks are, of our time. And I mentioned relationality. It allows one to get at things more deeply and more quickly than, discrete, say, book forms, for example. I mentioned multimedia and its participatory formation. It's inter and transdisciplinary, which I'll come back to in due course. And in terms of writing, right, I mean, there's an interesting, and there's been a lot now, I'll come back to this too, there's been a good deal on the impact on reading as a result of digital media, right, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's been much less work on the impact on writing, which has been dramatic. I mean, just think of instant messaging and the impact on how people write and communicate and so on and so forth, right? And so metaphor, I think, has loomed much larger. It's not that it wasn't there before, of course, but it's become a kind of dominant mode in how we convey meaning. And then, once again, in terms of knowledge making, on the one hand, the massive accumulation, whereas on the other, right, a recourse to just-in-time or on-demand kind of knowledge, which then impacts how we think about knowledge itself. Expert-driven, peer-to-peer distributed on the other hand, authoritative and peer-contributive, people sitting on their own, in limited forms of collaboration, whereas the cloud has become increasingly of our time, right, where all knowledge is aggregated into sort of common holding forms, uniform on the one hand and modular. So the kinds of, I mean, if you think of the kinds of web developments that come out of this, I mean, that first 1.0 static web pages and so on, right, modularity, which produces a kind of uniformity in itself, even though there's a proliferation of platforms. If you think of Drupal, right, Drupal programming to develop web pages, that's a modular system. So you've got these modules on the page, almost in blocks, right, and the beauty of it is that you can change a module without changing it. I mean, its relation to everything else changes, but you don't have to go in and change the entire page, for example. And then, oddly enough, you almost mark Microsoft and Google as contrasting modalities in all of this. So what then amounts to a networked imagination, right? On the one hand, openness, right? Openness, and maybe this is just sort of, again, cliche, but I think there's something deeper to it. The openness of systems, right? The capacity to, or the drive to develop open systems that they can then be modified. Openness of content, right? So anybody can contribute, and the content develops over time through contribution. And of course, interoperability, which is a major challenge. If there's something that will do us in, it's a failure of interoperability. And perhaps I'll come back, time permitting, to talk a bit more about that in an example we've been facing. The second is connectedness. I've been stressing those things throughout, so I won't go through it again. Attribution, how does one attribute in this open mode, right? Who claims credit for what gets done, or credit to be claimed at all, right? How you get credit, right? If you're in a knowledge factory like a university, right? And you're being assessed on the basis of what you contribute, right? It puts extreme pressure on how we think about assessment and contribution, right? So Creative Commons, of course, has been, again, another open source non-profit kind of organization, which has been very concerned about providing legal models regarding attribution and credit claim for thinking about these things. It gives you different options, and I urge you, if you haven't used Creative Commons, that you do. Don't give your copyright to a publisher if you can help it, right? I mean, let them let them say. I mean, they're making money off you, right? So if you publish in a journal, for example, when they ask me for copyright, I say no, right? I'm going to keep copyright. You can do what you want. You're making something of me already. I want to use this in any way I care, right? It's my work, right? And they squirm and complain bitterly, and in the end they'll probably publish it. And if they don't, you probably don't want to be published, right? I mean, I think it's as straightforward as that. And you should be insistent. You say, well, what's in it for me? Why am I giving you something to make something off of me when I'm all I'm getting out of it is maybe a little bit of credit from a university. And then assessment, again I'll come back to this, is how we think differently about modes of assessment, right? And badging is emerging and we're involved fairly centrally in the development of badges for learning capacities, which I'll come back to in due course. So now for humanities, turning to the humanities more directly, given that background. So, we've got a whole range of literacies that we really are engaged with. One is cultural, obviously, the languages, religions, literatures, histories, all forms of cultural expression in which we are and should be engaged. And cultural expression is transforming as a result of the impact of these technologies. We want to ask ourselves, how should we be engaging as humanists with thinking about the development of these new cultural forms, right? And how are they linked to old cultural forms? The second is visual, still in moving images. Their syntax and semantics, and they're obviously part of the challenge here is how we compose in multimedia formats, what multimedia formats are available, right, and how we publish, right, in multimedia formats. Not easy, quite expensive actually to provide those platforms, and how are academic institutions thinking about that and their assessment. And then techno-scientific, how the technology impacts is impacted by the human a concern that has always been central to the humanities, even as we've denied it. But there's been a long skeptical tradition in the humanities in relation to the humanities, in relation to the technological in various ways. So just a very quick overview of the history of humanities, humanities in relation to computing. Arguably, you could say that the interest, comes out of older conceptions of the philosophy of mind. I mean, from the point of view of the humanities, of the philosophy of mind. So, and indeed, 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, artificial intelligence. What it produced sort of at the beginning of the era of the web in the early 1990s was a formation that came to call itself humanities and computing, or computing and humanities. And the early investment in these areas by you might say the pioneers, right, in the field, was really bringing available computing technology as it got inherited from computing science in particular, and applying it to existing knowledge in the humanities without changing that knowledge whatsoever, or without seeming to change that knowledge whatsoever. So, the very early forms of it, right, the Virginia Institute for Academic Technology in the Humanities, VIAT, at the University of Virginia, MITH, the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities. These were early contributors, early institutional formations. So people like Jeremy McGann, right, the development of archives, of early search engines, people like John Unsworth and so on, and concordances were the initial interest, right? So it was really trying to add to the capacity of the humanities to do what the humanities did anyway, didn't look to change anything. And they were really quite conventional humanists for the most part, McGann maybe aside, but certainly the likes of Unsworth and others who were involved in this early formation. And what you got out of this were things like the Perseus archive, which became the Perseus Digital Library, which was an archive of classics, right? Collections of in classics. Just bringing them online, right? As a fairly conventional archive, and then sort of mapping that. There was a kind of sister project called the Theologica Linguae Graecae, which was started at Irvine and still runs today, along similar lines. Now, notice, I mean, this is a map from about 7 or 8 years ago. The Perseus collections are all in the global north, right? You see almost nothing, certainly almost nothing in Africa, and very, very little in Latin America, right? I mean, they've sort of begun to address that in sort of modest ways, but it's very, very almost stereotypically constrained to sort of collections and interest in the global north, and I stress its conventionality in that sense. The Dickinson Electronic Archives, which started by collecting, not just collecting the works of Emily Dickinson and putting them online, but developing search engines, and sort of scoffed at the development of the search engines were almost counting the number of instances of a certain term in the text, like love, for example. And it leaves scholarship unchanged, quite frankly. It doesn't lead to asking any particularly interesting questions. I mean, when you just, it's not the number of uses of a term like love, it's how she's using love. And is she using, are the uses changing, over time or in the text from one context to another. And so this then led in about 2002, 3, 4, the Computing and Humanist group started an association called Computing in the Humanities, or Computing and the Humanities. That was the kind of holding organization, And then this led, I mean, there was a big kind of debate in about 2003-04, and the founding of Haystack by Cathy Davidson and I sort of were engaged in this. That we were quite critical of the really uninteresting humanistic engagement around these questions, no matter the technological engagement, right? And it led to the transformation of computing and the humanities literally into digital humanities. I mean, the very term changed, even if the practices on the computing and humanities side didn't change at all, interestingly enough. So that the Journal for Computing and Humanities became the Digital Humanities Quarterly, literally overnight, right? Kind of, which is now, you know, I don't want to say an interesting site. So you get articles by people, a good friend of mine, Patrick Svensson, who runs a fantastic institute at Umeå University in Sweden called HumLab. So if you can pull that up, HUMLAB, which is a really, really creative humanities lab, right, for the creation of interesting work. And he's really an interesting guy. So he's written a series of 4 articles, 3 of which have appeared and the 4th of which is about to appear in Digital Humanities Quarterly, really about the history of the formation of computing and the humanities, the emergence of digital humanities out of that formation, and so on. They run an annual conference and so on and so forth. So what you get now, right, is a kind of sense of communities of practice, right, an engagement from the humanities with those in engineering, computer science, the sciences, and so forth, in really quite creative ways, jointly composed archives across dispersed communities, and deeply collaborative work. And it's impacted how we do the humanities in various sorts of ways. I'm just going to go on, sorry, in the interest of time, skip 1 or 2 things. So I just want to mention over here the sort of, you know, the sense of collaboration in and coming out of the humanities. You know, clearly language and sociality is a completely collaborative, interactive engagement. So we kind of overlook that when we're thinking about collaboration. And when we think about humanities and collaboration, right, you know, at best, it's a kind of, you know, input-output model. So collaboration in, individual output, right? So, I mean, if you look at the acknowledgements in books, you know, besides thanking, you know, mother and wife and husband and daughters and dogs and et cetera, right? We tend to thank librarians, right? I mean, so there's some kind of collaboration taking place there, even as it's a great, brilliant scholar individually producing the text, right? So it's collaboration in, right, individual output. And that, I mean, that model is under considerable pressure now, you know, as a result of the sorts of tensions that are emerging, right? So the first is the tension between disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. I mean, I hate these kinds of diagrams. I couldn't find a better one. But you see here, discipline at the edge kind of impacting, right, sort of knowledge formation at the center, where with interdisciplinarity, there are these radical networks that are kind of interlocked with each other in impressive ways. So that's the first tension between the discipline and the interdiscipline. The second is, I mean, if you look at all of this, you know, there's almost no explicit, I mean, there's very little explicit humanities kind of mapped out over here by name, right? I mean, you might find it embedded in anthropology or in film studies and so on and so forth, right? But there's you know, the tension between the digital and the humanistic. And what is interesting, I mean, this is King's College, which is another one of those very early institutional formations around humanities and computing being very active. And that, you know, they build projects and programs and so on, not unlike, say, the Center for New Media and History and New Media at George Mason University outside DC, which Ray Rosenzweig founded, is now run by Dan Cohen. Right, again, the humanities are barely impacted other than in terms of sort of volume, right? But how we do the humanities or think about the transformation in the humanities is hardly impacted. And then the third tension is between the human. So who are these figures? Who's this guy? Nietzsche, right? I mean, you have to know he is, right? So Jean-Paul Sartre, and this is Heidegger, of course, right? So between, and of course, I mean, there are no women in this formation because of the kind of traditional mode of things. But the notion between the human and the post-human, right? And how we think about the post-human and the impact of technology on the production of the post-human, and Carrie Wolf's notion of posthumanism, maybe Jack Halberstam, Judith Halberstam's sort of engagement with these questions as well. So Carrie Wolf has mapped out, maybe somewhat problematically, so where the major figures in the contribution to post-humanist sort of studies fall. So obviously Donna Haraway is an important figure in all of this. So I want to, just in the interest of time, move on a good deal and then sort of end by opening it up with some questions. I think of humanities as having its own 3 R's. There are various versions of this, and we'll come to a more radical version at the end. But reading, writing, reasoning, right? And how we think about each of these has been, I think, dramatically, if not radically, impacted by the technological and by computerization and social media in various ways. So there's been a lot of work on reading practices, right? That we read differently, than before technologies like this were available. Right? We read with hyperlinks. We go back and forth. Even the layout of things like magazines, or print magazines, now look very different as a result in design, right? As a result of the impact of these changed formulations of reading. So if you look at almost any magazine today, it tends not to be linear, right? It might have some linear articles where you start at the beginning and at the end, but it's going to have, boxes and other things to sort of draw your attention away sort of while you're reading through the article and so forth, and so on, right? And that design feature is really the result of the kind of transformation in reading practices with which we'd be engaged. There's been much less attention to the transformation in writing practices and the shift from what I call writing to composition, right? To making things together in multimediated forms, right? As a result of mobile technologies and the kind of technologies we use on a daily basis. And I think there's been recently a bit of focus in this area, but when you think of the transformation in language use just by using IM and texting and sort of how we write, right? Or even more conventionally, for those of you who can remember writing before the age of computers with a typewriter, or even before before one kind of moved to a typewriter, how difficult it was to edit. You would write out a whole kind of draft, and then you'd have to go back and almost redo the whole draft or cross things out and get somebody to do it for you, and so on and so forth. And then, now the transformation in draft from one to another, right? Think of, you've all used Google Docs, I think, right? Kind of to compose something together in a Google Doc, right, at a distance. And, as you're changing something, somebody else is changing something, and you're watching, with great curiosity, okay, what are they changing? And maybe I'm going to go change it back, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a contestation, or there's an engagement around sort of the practice of writing together, or etherpads, right, and so on and so forth. Just a whole range of tools that transform how we think about writing and writing together in collaborative engagement and composition and so on. And this is just a joke, we've always written with a little help from our friends. Socrates did never write, but Plato surely kind of imbibed a bit. But you think of Freud and Sartre and just a whole range of others who got a little help from their friends, right? Okay, so some examples, and I don't mean to sort of focus on myself here, but Vectors was a really interesting platform for a while. It was a digital journal started by Terry McPherson at the University of Southern California. It cost about $150,000 to produce a single issue of the journal when you added it all together. So, you know, incredibly expensive to put together. I mean, I was on the board of it, and she asked me. I'm just going to use my piece because I know it best. Vectors no longer exist. I'll say why in a minute. This was the last issue that they created. It was a multimedia platform where you could compose something, right, that included text, image, and audio or music. I had written an article in a conventional journal on post-Katrina New Orleans and race, and Taro asked me to just translate that into a Vectors piece, thinking it could be done like in 3 weeks. And oh yeah, sure, 3 weeks, no problem, easy, right? Took me a year. Completely, I mean, I rewrote the entire thing with completely different contribution by the time I was done. And what was so interesting, you know, I was not doing it on my own. I was working with a designer, right, a programmer. I was working with a graduate student who did a lot of the data collection for me, and who got, you know, co-composition credit. What was so interesting is that the form of my writing dramatically transformed. I mean, I took license with how one could actually write, right? Became, I mean, there was a greater poetics. There's a way of reading that's very different than conventional reading in a magazine, in a journal. You go back and forth between things. You can start in the middle and you know, go in whatever which way you want, and it produced some really interesting contributions. So David Lloyd on the potato famine in Ireland, a medieval studies contribution on the historiography of medieval studies, and so on and so forth. I mean, you know, Karen Kaplan on war games, video game war games, and ways of seeing, right, from aerial vantage points and so on and so on. Like really, really, really interesting work that you don't get in conventional, and you know, the composing of archives in various ways. So you know, Vectors basically ran out of funding. And what was interesting about this was I wanted music. You know, so I had things like Dr. John, you know, going back to New Orleans, kind of, you know, where you could get like 10 seconds of, you know, without violating copyright law, right? Get a little clip of, right? But then I was working, a very close friend of mine, his wife is a very famous avant-garde opera composer in China. Really interesting. Who's also sung jazz with the likes of Ornette Coleman and so on and so forth. And she had a composition that she gave to me that you're sort of hearing in the background over here, which was perfect because it was all about ghosts and hauntedness and so on and so forth, which is what part of my argument was about post-Katrina New Orleans, right? So there's an interesting way to sew music and sound into the sound stream of the thing. So cultural analytics comes out of software studies, Lev Manovich and his name will come to me in a minute, a young scholar at UC San Diego, Jeremy Douglas. And you know, they work at the California Institute for Technology and Telecommunications, which is CalIT2, which has enormous technological resources. And so they're able to use a hyperwall, which is the largest hyperwall in the world, right? Which is, you know, consists of something like 52 televisions strung together. And you can project, I mean, scientists use it in order to project, you know, brain images and so on. So they project cultural product, right, or over time, to be able to do a time-lapse analysis of the transformation in cultural development over time that then allows you to see things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see, right? So there's a, you know, and they've developed this notion, they've managed to develop this notion of cultural analytics that have come out of it. So the kind of thing is to take, I don't know, the covers of Time magazine, you know, from very early in the 20th century, and to map their transformation over time, right, to see who's on the cover, how the covers are changing, what issues are changing, what the gender politics are, right? So they're all men until, you know, at least the 1960s or later, I forget the exact dates. And then, you know, the transformation in their content over time, and how that speaks to cultural transformations that are taking place in American society, and maybe, and it's increasing globalization sort of over time as well, right? So an interesting project. They've done it with comic books in various ways and so on and so forth. But you could do it with more, you know, more conventional humanistic content, sort of historically speaking. So I don't know, putting medieval manuscripts up there, you know, and being able to compare the hand-script, literally the hand of the different illustrators, right? Sort of over time. So cultural analytics has gotten a fair bit of funding out of the likes of NEH and Mellon and so on and so forth. And then vectors transformed into scalar. So this is the development of a new, more easy to use multimedia platform for publishing, which if it scales, they're in the process of trying to see whether it scales, is likely to transform how we think of publishing, of composition, precisely because it's designed for anybody to go in and be able to use it, right, in a fairly user-friendly kind of way, to engage in multimedia publication that then allows, you know, all of you to go and create, you know, image and text and sound run together in sort of interesting ways. So they're in a perpetual beta phase. It's been launched. They have Mellon backing and I think some NEH backing, and have run a series of summer workshops for the use of that one can apply to, and if one gets accepted, it's like a month-long or 6-week-long intensive workshop engagement with using Scalar. And the most interesting, I've seen various projects that have developed out of it, sort of in an experimental phase. The most interesting project I've seen is by Kevin Hamilton and Neda Gorman at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and it's a project on nuclear testing. Right? There's a film archive from the 1950s, a really interesting film archive from New Mexico, from Los Alamos, and they've archived the entire series of documentaries, and have begun to develop an analytic engagement with those materials about the development of kind of nuclear America. Right, it's kind of over time. It's a really, really interesting project. What makes it so interesting is not just its content, though Kevin Hamilton is a very sophisticated digital artist, and Neda Gorman is in rhetoric at Illinois. What is interesting is their use of Scalar, which was much more creative in its output than any other. The other projects tended to look like each other. They were very box-like, Drupal kind of driven project. So, you know, I mean, it's interesting that the programming places a kind of framing, right, that then constrains sort of how you see, and they were what you actually look at in terms of the project development. What was interesting about their project is they completely cut across the conventional framing in creative programming or reprogramming of Scalar as a platform. Hypercities, anybody know what Hypercities, anybody looked at Hypercities? Hypercities is out of UCLA, a terrific archive, living archive, developing out of UCLA. It started up by looking at Berlin. So Todd Presner is a German scholar at UCLA, came out of Stanford, trained in part at the Stanford Humanities Lab. And he started by doing an archive of Weimar Berlin, which he was interested in. He was interested in mobility, trains, the role of trains in the Weimar Republic, and then right in the expansion of the Third Reich and so on. And then it added it deepened the archive to go all the way back to 1750. So it was an archive of the mapping of Berlin from 1750 to the contemporary moment. And now they've radically expanded the number of cities they engage with. So Lima, Peru, Rome, Tel Aviv. With Fukushima, they started a project in Japan of real-time mapping of the levels of nuclear pollution, right, and so on. So it's really a living archive in an amazing way. They've mapped Filipina town in LA. I mean, they have a big project. Phil Etherington at USC, who's a partner of theirs, has been engaged in a 12,000-year history of Los Angeles, right? So a really deep history of Los Angeles. That's now up on Hypercities as part of the LA archive of Hypercities. So there's an amazing range of work sort of represented in this, and it's at hypercities.com. Anybody can go and register. It's free, you can use the resources, you contribute to the resources. It's clearly peer-to-peer, contributory, and participatory in exactly that kind of way. There's a great project by Patricia Seed, who's an historian. She came out of Rice, now UC Irvine in history. Probably the most sophisticated digital mapper that I know. Really has been at this for almost 15 years, 12, 13 years. And she's done this project on Portuguese cartography of coastal Africa from roughly 1480 to 1530, which has produced these extraordinary, I mean, she has the collection of these very, very early maps. So it's in part a history of cartography, a history of mapping, right, like no other. I mean, there's a project of Harvard about medieval mapping that is maybe comparable with which is involved. And you can see that what she's done is she's mapped these historical names onto contemporary African maps to see exactly where the location is. And what it's begun to do is to transform the way one thinks about slave trades and slave routes in Africa, on the part of the Portuguese in the late 15th and early 16th century. Fantastic project. I mean, really, incomparable in it. And she's a really, really sophisticated historian, but who's also done the hard work in terms of digital cartography, right? So the beauty of these maps are just incomparable as well. I mean, they're incredible art pieces, right? Sort of from the 15th century. So you get versions of this. I mean, when you think that this was done in, I think, 1492, right? I mean, the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Kind of, think of the sophistication of the imaginary of Africa at that moment in time to produce a map like this, right? I mean, that's almost, I mean, if you compare it to other maps of Africa at the time, it's incredible. And so she has a collection of the transformation of the cartographic imagination as a consequence. I was heavily involved in a project in the mid-2000s called Traces, which was a project on mapping the history of redlining in California cities, 8 major California cities, all of which were connected to the University of California campuses at the time, from the 1930s through the 1980s. So we got from the Federal Archive, the National Archive, we got all the original maps and digitized them of these cities, including LA, San Diego, Oakland, San Francisco, Sacramento, Fresno, and so on, and linked them to an archive of municipal regulations and insurance company regulations that are offered to insurers that produced the redlining, right, the racial redlining of each of these cities, and you can map. I mean, it's connected to the Federal Housing Authority in the 1930s, and the sort of explicitness of the racial configuration of the redlining of cities is absolutely stunning. I mean, using the most vituperative language in the 1930s, and then mapping that over time and showing that the segregation in, say, La Jolla, which is the upscale area of California in which the University of California, San Diego is located. So there was an area in the 1930s that was reserved, segregated for servants. That's where the servants lived, and of course the most degenerate housing stock available at the time. And if you go and look there today, it's still the most low-income, the only low-income aspect, in an area which has homes with many multi-million dollars. This is still the most segregated area in which Latino and to some extent Black residents live. So that's a project that is now online, and Richard has gone on. We've sought money to expand the project to other cities nationwide in the US. And we're waiting on those possibilities. There's a project that came out of UCLA, the Virtual Culture Lab, that maps that reconstructs medieval cities as well as the Roman Forum. So this is a version of the Roman Forum. Bernie Frischer, who was the director of that lab, went to Virginia to become the head of IATH, the Virginia Institute for that I mentioned. And so he has a partner project there, and this has continued. But again, it gives students a way of actually walking into, virtual reconstructions of, say, the Roman Forum or famous medieval cities and so on and so forth. So getting to the end, I'd mentioned badging as an alternative form of assessment. There's a huge project funded by the MacArthur Foundation, in which I'm centrally involved, to explore the capacity of badging as an alternative form of assessment for all forms of learning, including higher education, where the badges are certifications offered by peer learning communities for the learning that one's acquired over time, rather than for hierarchical sort of top-down forms of learning, where the learning is peer-to-peer from each other. The expertise involved is really a facilitation, not a kind of dumping of knowledge content on student learners. And we've just run, we just 2 weeks ago awarded over $3 million in grant awards for developing badging systems for peer-to-peer versions of learning, working very, very closely with the Mozilla Foundation, whom I mentioned, the Firefox folk, who have provided the background platform with the MacArthur Foundation. Gates Foundation has contributed some funding. And I think you're going to hear a good deal more about this going forward. There's a lot of investment to transform learning practices and how one accredits and acknowledges learning practices as a consequence. So, these are not your Scout badges, right? I mean, this is a very different form of badging than one is used to. And there are all kinds of interesting projects taking place in its name, from nature conservancy projects for kids to university level projects in terms of peer-to-peer learning practices. And it puts enormous pressure on how we think about pedagogy in university structures, right? Let me just mention one example. It'll be online fairly shortly. I did a forum more or less a week ago, just before I left, on this trip. at my institute called the Technological University We Could Be For, which included people like Nishan Shah and Jeff Bowker and Johanna Drucker and so on, thinking aloud about that sort of question. And so we'll post that video online. And Johanna Drucker, who's at UCLA and is an historian of the alphabet and of the book, had a really, really interesting presentation about the transformation of the library as a learning space, right? And how one thinks the future of the library, right, in an academic environment. And the engagement of students in learning practices. And so she laid out a kind of imaginary, utopian, futuristic, but not so futuristic vision of what that might look like. And I just encourage you just to pay attention. It should be up in about a week. Well worth going to look at, just to sort of spark the imagination of how this might play out. And then, just in terms of the examples, connected learning is what we're calling this new form of learning that is taking place, peer-to-peer participatory learning. That Mimi Ito, who is the director of the research hub that I oversee, she's the research director of the hub, and she's an anthropologist and educationist by training, and is really probably the most sophisticated thinker about the set of practices that we're marking by this notion of connected learning. And there's a bunch of material online about it. I just want to mention this because it brings it back into our engagement with critical thought. You know, there's a question of where criticality lies in all of this. There are a few websites. I mean, you could go and look at a forum, an online forum called 4 Humanities, which is using digital platforms in order to advocate for humanities, started by the likes of Alan Liu at UC Santa Barbara and Jeffrey Rockwell, who I think was originally here, right, and he's now in Calgary, right, and so, I was asked to be involved with that, but there was a set of exchanges sort of going back and forth on a listserv where we were discussing this. And one guy who will go unnamed, not any of the people I've named so far, who's in Australia, said, just kind of done, no more Foucault, please. And I just thought, like, what are you thinking? It's kind of, I mean, this kind of recourse to a kind of conventional, we should have no critical thought over here. We want a very conventional, and I just kind of lost it, right? So it takes quite a bit to get me going, but this was it, right? This sort of notion of, I mentioned last time, reason is overrated, just go for it. This kind of, complete denial of a kind of engagement with critical thought, which we need now more than ever, right? And the digital is certainly not going to be our way out of this. So I just want to mention a few challenges by way of summary, and then I'll end. I'm sorry to have gone so long. The first is a shift from authorship as individual to authorship as collective. Collaborative, collective authorship is not easy, right? It's incredibly interesting. You transform the way you think in the process, right? And that's partly the point, right? It gets you to think differently, both about the interaction, but also about what it is that you're producing together. It requires you to give up on some things, not always easy, right? But also to stand on principle when there's really principle to be stood on. Really is transformative in how one thinks about one's own work. So, if you haven't engaged in any considerable extent in collaborative composition, I urge you to do it. The shift from auteurship to remix, I've mentioned some of this, so I'm not going to go back to it, we can discuss it. From concentrated expertise to distributed expertise, again, it means giving up on some sort of commitment sometimes. That shift from education as top-down to learning as more distributed and peer-to-peer and participatory, interest-driven, passion-driven, and so on and so forth, not to be too cliched about it. from the hierarchical to sort of community arrangements, but where there's a kind of critical conception of what we think of as community. So not a closed community, but a sort of open communities, and open source, of course, is incredibly important. From passivity to participatory, how you think about the classroom as a participatory space, not as a passive space where students are just learning from you, but really engage with each other. How one thinks about workshop forums among colleagues as a participatory space. I'm not engaged in it at the moment because I'm a talking head, unfortunately, but we might sort of think about that. And then, something that deeply worries me within the humanities, the relation between technologism and textualism leading to a new formalism, which I think we're seeing all too much within the humanities today. Representations, the Journal of Berkeley did an issue on formalism not so long ago that is well worth looking at. There's some really interesting contributions to it. But you're seeing a kind of formula. English departments are the worst culprits. I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but the threat of all of this is leading to a kind of retreat into a kind of formalism. Let's go back to analyzing the formal dimensions of text, right? That I think is very, very deep at this point in time, and not something we can just lightly dismiss or ignore, right? Sort of as a kind of critical object of analysis, all too easy as a kind of response to all of this, and in a way, I mean, the fairly non-critical engagement with digital media, right, helps to produce it, right, because it's in a way can be seen as apolitical even when it's not, right? Is a deep worry. So I'll just end with this. There probably is no exit from all of this, right? And then, I promised the 3 R's, right? This seems to be, the Occupy version of the 3 R's, right? So I'll just leave it at that, and we should open this up to a larger conversation. Thanks, Daniel. You did a good job.